Late one night in 1994, in a quiet corner of Michigan, a young wife vanished from her own kitchen without a sound. For 21 years, her husband believed she was gone forever. Then, on an ordinary evening, a video that had nothing to do with her at all changed everything he thought he knew. The town of Holland, Michigan is known for its spring tulip festivals and its warm, small town charm. Sitting right on the edge of Lake Macatawa, it's the kind of place where neighbors know each other by first name, and where the changing seasons still dictate the rhythm of daily life. By November, the color drains out of the trees. The skies turn a heavy, permanent gray, and the wind blowing off Lake Michigan sends everyone retreating indoors, toward their fireplaces, to wait out the long winter. It was in this quiet, insulated town that Arthur and Caroline Pendelton built their life together. Arthur was 28, a loan officer at a local community bank. Quiet, methodical. A man who liked routines, liked numbers, liked the simple comfort of a predictable day. Caroline was his opposite in almost every way. 26 years old, vibrant, endlessly curious. She worked at a small downtown antique shop restoring damaged books. She had a gift for taking things that were broken, or forgotten, or falling apart, and bringing them carefully back to life. She spent her days with her hands stained in leather glue and bookbinding thread, humming to herself in the back room of the shop. They met at the local library 3 years earlier, and everyone who knew them agreed it looked like love at first sight. Arthur gave Caroline stability. Caroline gave Arthur color. They bought a small 2-story craftsman house on a tree-lined street a few miles from the water, and their home always smelled faintly of brewed tea, vanilla candles, and old paper. On the surface, and to Arthur himself, their marriage looked close to perfect. No shouting matches, no crushing debt, none of the dark secrets that usually turn up once a couple ends up on the evening news. Just two young people, quietly building a future together. Saturday, November 12, 1994, was supposed to be a milestone. It was their 3rd wedding anniversary. Arthur had spent weeks planning the night, quietly saving up bonus checks from the bank to book a table at the Commodore, an upscale seafood restaurant right on the water. The kind of place with dim lighting, white linen, and a view of the lake crashing against the icy docks. Caroline had been talking about wanting to go there for months. That evening, the weather turned bitter. A lake-effect snowstorm was rolling in, dusting the streets in a thin layer of white. Caroline spent an hour getting ready upstairs, and when she finally came down, Arthur felt his breath catch the same way it had on their wedding day. She wore a long, dark green velvet dress that matched her eyes, her hair pulled back with a simple silver clip. She smiled, looped her arm through his, and they drove to the restaurant listening to soft music on the radio, talking about the holidays ahead. Caroline seemed happy, genuinely happy. She talked about a rare first-edition book she was restoring at the shop, her eyes lighting up the way they always did when she talked about her work. There was no anxiety in her voice, no hesitation, nothing at that point to suggest anything was wrong. Dinner went beautifully. They shared a bottle of wine, laughed about old memories, toasted to the life they were building together. Arthur remembers feeling, in that exact moment, completely and undeniably lucky. Then the waiter cleared their plates and brought out dessert, and something in the air shifted. Arthur was mid-story, telling Caroline about something funny that happened at the bank that week, when he looked up expecting to see her smiling. Instead, she was staring blankly past his shoulder, out through the restaurant's bay window into the dark parking lot. The color had drained completely from her face. Her eyes were locked on something out there in the swirling snow. Arthur turned to look. The lot was dim, half a dozen cars dusted in white, nothing unusual that he could see. Just wind off the lake. When he turned back and touched Caroline's hand, her skin was ice cold and she flinched, hard like she'd been physically pulled out of a trance. She laughed it off, said she had a sudden headache, blamed the wine, the rich food. She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. The woman who'd walked into the restaurant an hour earlier was gone. In her place was someone who looked like she wanted to crawl out of her own skin. Arthur asked for the check immediately. He helped her into her coat and walked her to the car, and the drive home felt like a different world from the drive there. The radio felt intrusive. Caroline stared straight ahead at the road, but every few minutes her eyes flicked to the side mirror, checking the reflection behind them. When Arthur asked if she thought someone was following them, she shook her head quickly. "Just the snow playing tricks in the headlights," she said. They got home just after 9. The street was silent, the porch light casting long shadows across the lawn. Once inside, hoping to salvage what was left of the night, Arthur asked Caroline to sit on the couch. He'd been hiding something in his desk drawer for weeks, a small wrapped box. Inside was a custom silver locket, fitted with one of their wedding photographs. Caroline stared at it for a long moment. Her hands started to tremble. And then she looked up at Arthur, and her eyes were full of tears, not happy ones. Something heavier. She threw her arms around his neck and held on tighter than she ever had before, and into his shoulder she whispered a sentence Arthur would replay in his head every night for the next 21 years. "You gave me the best years of my life, Arthur. I love you so much. Please never forget how much I love you." He held her, confused, chalking it up to emotion and the tail end of her headache. He kissed her forehead, told her he loved her too, and suggested they go up to bed. Caroline nodded, set the locket on the coffee table, and went upstairs. Arthur stayed down a few minutes longer, turned off the lamps, checked the front door lock, adjusted the thermostat. By the time he got into bed, Caroline was already under the covers, facing away from him. He fell asleep fast, worn out from a long week at the bank. The next morning, Sunday, November 13th, Arthur woke up on his own. No alarm, just the cold gray light through the curtains. He reached across the bed for his wife. The space beside him was empty, and the sheets were cold. He figured she'd gotten up early for tea, like she often did on Sundays. He called her name into the hallway. Nothing. Checked the bathroom, empty. Towels folded. Toothbrush right where it always sat. He went downstairs expecting the smell of chamomile and toast. Instead, the house felt wrong. Heavy. Too cold. He walked toward the kitchen, and a blast of freezing wind hit him in the chest before he even reached the doorway. If this story has kept you watching so far, go ahead and hit subscribe. It genuinely helps the channel keep telling stories like this one. The back door stood wide open, snow blowing across the hardwood floor. Arthur's heart slammed against his ribs. Had someone broken in? He slammed the door shut, locked it with shaking hands, and turned to scan the kitchen. Nothing was disturbed. Drawers closed. Knives still in the block. No footprints, no broken glass, no sign of a struggle. Caroline's winter coat still hung on the rack by the pantry. Her purse sat on the bench underneath. Her car keys were on the counter. If she'd gone for a walk or a drive, she hadn't taken any of it, and it was 20 degrees outside. Then Arthur saw it. Resting on the marble island was the silver anniversary locket he'd given her hours earlier. The clasp was undone, the chain coiled in a small, deliberate circle. And an inch away from it, staining the white marble, was a single, perfect drop of dried blood. He touched it. Dry, cold, real. The panic that had been building finally broke through. Arthur ran for the wall phone and dialed 911. Barely able to get a sentence out, his wife was gone. The back door had been open. There was blood on the counter. The dispatcher told him to step outside and wait. Within 10 minutes, the street was lit up with the lights of 3 patrol cars. Detective Sterling arrived shortly after, a heavy-set man with sharp, patient eyes, 15 years on the Holland force, known for staying calm in chaos. He took in the unfastened locket, the drop of blood, and the open back door, then stepped out onto the porch and swept his flashlight across the yard. Snow had been falling steadily since 9 the night before, laying down a clean, undisturbed blanket over the grass. Except for one trail. A single line of footprints leading away from the porch, steps small, bare, human footprints, pressed into the fresh snow. Sterling called Arthur over to confirm the size. Caroline had small feet. The prints matched. There was no sign of struggle in the trail, no drag marks, no second set of prints beside her. It looked, impossibly, like she had unlocked the door, taken off her shoes, and walked willingly out into the freezing night. The trail led straight to the back gate, out into the alley used for garbage pickup, and there the footprints simply stopped. In their place, the snow had been crushed flat by the tread of a car that had been idling, waiting. Caroline had walked out of her warm home, barefoot in 20-degree weather, and climbed into a car that then drove off into the storm. By sunrise, Arthur's quiet life had become a nightmare. In any case involving a missing wife, the husband is the first suspect, and Detective Sterling didn't make an exception. Arthur handed over his finances, signed off on a full search of the house, took a polygraph without hesitation. He begged the detectives to focus on the restaurant, on the way Caroline's face had drained of color at that window, on the fear in the car, on the way she clung to him, and asked him never to forget how much she loved him. Investigators went to the Commodore and interviewed the host, the valets, the waiter who'd served them. The waiter's account matched Arthur's story exactly. The couple had seemed happy the entire night, right up until Caroline froze at the window, looking like she'd seen a ghost. But the parking lot security footage was useless. The storm had blurred the lens into static and shadow. There was no way to confirm whether anyone had actually been standing outside. When the lab results came back that Tuesday, the case only got stranger. The blood on the counter was Caroline's type, but the medical examiner noted something odd about it. It wasn't a splatter, and it wasn't a smear from a struggle. It was a small, perfect circle. The kind of mark left by a deliberate prick to the finger, likely from the sharp clasp pin on the back of the locket itself. It looked as though Caroline had pricked her own finger and left the blood behind on purpose. But why leave a clue at all unless she wanted someone to notice she was gone? Caroline's parents drove in from out of state. They didn't blame Arthur. They simply held him and cried, certain their daughter would never walk away from her family without a word. The town organized search parties. Volunteers combed the woods near the lake. The Coast Guard ran sonar across Lake Makatawa in case a car had gone into the water. They found nothing. Not a shoe. Not a scrap of fabric. Nothing at all. Winter dragged on, and the case went cold the way most do, not with a bang, but with silence. The news coverage faded. The flyers on the street lamps froze, then tore away in the wind. Sterling kept the file on top of his desk, chasing every tip, but every lead ended at the same wall. Caroline had no enemies, no secret debts, no hidden life anyone could find. She had simply disappeared into the snow. If this story has kept you with us this far, consider subscribing. There's a lot more of this case still to come. By the spring of 1995, the snow had melted, but Arthur hadn't. He'd taken a leave of absence from the bank because he couldn't focus on a single number. He spent his days on the couch, staring at the empty cushion beside him, turning the silver locket over in his hands. Eventually, knowing he couldn't keep living in a museum of his own grief, Arthur decided to start packing away some of Caroline's things. He couldn't touch her clothes yet, so he started with something smaller. The little spare room upstairs she'd turned into a home studio for her book restoration work. Her desk was still cluttered with tools, jars of binding adhesive, a magnifying glass. 3 antique books sat stacked in the corner, brought home from the shop over the winter. He picked up the first one to box it up, and something felt wrong. It was far too light for its size. Arthur sat down at her desk and opened the cover. The book was hollow. Caroline had used a razor blade to carve out the center of every page, creating a hidden compartment inside the binding. Arthur's pulse picked up as he looked inside. At the bottom sat a thick stack of $100 bills banded together. At least $10,000, all of it untraceable. Beside the cash was a folded receipt, a one-way bus ticket from Chicago to Seattle, Washington, scheduled to depart at noon on Sunday, November 13th, 1994. The exact morning after their anniversary. The exact morning she'd vanished. But the ticket wasn't booked under the name Caroline Pendelton. Arthur reached back into the compartment and pulled out one last item, a laminated state driver's license. The photo was unmistakably Caroline. Her face, her dark hair, her green eyes. But the name printed beside it read Julian Croft. The birth date made her 3 years older than he'd always believed, and the state of issue wasn't Michigan. It was Pennsylvania. His entire marriage cracked open in that quiet, dusty room. His wife hadn't just vanished, she'd been preparing to vanish, under a different name, with cash she'd hidden for who knows how long. But if she'd had it already, the money, the ID, the ticket, why leave it behind? She hadn't run. She'd been taken before she got the chance. Arthur didn't wait for morning. He drove straight to the station with the book, the cash, and the license, and dropped it all on Detective Sterling's desk. Sterling ran the name Julian Croft through the database, and what came back turned the whole investigation on its head. Julian Croft was real, a little girl, born in Pennsylvania, who had died in a car accident in 1972 at the age of 4. Sterling explained it to a stunned Arthur. Caroline had been using a technique known as ghosting, assuming the identity of a deceased child born around the same year, in order to obtain a real, legitimate driver's license under a fake name. It wasn't something a small-town book restorer figured out on her own. It required real connections, the kind that don't come cheap and don't come clean. Whatever Caroline had been running from, she'd been planning her escape for months, and whoever had taken her had found her first. Desperate for answers, Arthur and Sterling drove to the antique shop where Caroline had worked. The place was in total disarray, boxes everywhere. The owner, a soft-spoken older man named Silas Thorne, had been Caroline's mentor, the one who'd taught her everything about restoring old books. When they asked if he knew anything, Thorne looked heartbroken. He took off his glasses, wiped his eyes, and said Caroline had been like a daughter to him. The grief, he said, was too much. He was closing the shop for good and moving back east to be near family. Arthur felt only sympathy for the man. They shook hands, and Silas Thorne left Holland, Michigan for good. With Thorne gone, the fake ID pointing to a dead child, and the trail in the snow long since melted away, the case hit a wall it never recovered from. Caroline Pendleton was officially declared a cold case. 21 years passed. The world moved on, the internet reshaped everything. Payphones disappeared from street corners. Holland grew bigger and busier. But Arthur's life stayed exactly where it had stopped. Now 49, his hair gone salt and pepper, he'd never remarried, never really moved on. He still lived in the same craftsman house. The locket sat in a small glass case on the mantel, the drop of Caroline's blood still preserved inside it. He was a man defined by a mystery that refused to close. On a freezing Tuesday night in November of 2015, 21 years to the week since the anniversary dinner, Arthur was sitting alone with his laptop, scrolling to distract himself from a week that always hurt the most. A video auto-played on his screen. A short local news piece, recently gone viral. A small coastal town rallying to save a flooded, historic bookshop. It was set in Oak Haven, Washington. The footage showed volunteers hauling wood, sweeping water out of a damaged storefront, and then the camera cut inside to the shop's owner seated at a workbench, restoring a water-damaged antique book. Arthur stopped breathing. The woman was older, in her late 40s, her dark hair streaked with silver, a pair of reading glasses pushed up her nose. But before she opened the book's cover, she did something small and specific. She tapped the spine exactly 3 times with her index finger, then blew the dust away. It was the same habit he'd watched his wife perform 100 times in the spare room of their house 21 years ago. Arthur's hands started to shake. He paused the video and leaned in close to the screen, staring at the shape of her jaw, the line of her nose, the deep green of her eyes behind the glasses. It was Caroline. Alive, running a bookshop in Washington State, the exact state on that bus ticket from 21 years earlier. Relief crashed into him first, and then, right behind it, something sharper. If she was alive and free, why had she never called? Why the locket, the blood, the stage scene? Had their whole marriage been something she needed to escape? Arthur knew calling Sterling wasn't an option, not yet. If Caroline had faked her own disappearance, she could be facing serious charges. He needed to see her face to face and hear the truth before anyone else got involved. He didn't sleep that night. By morning, he was on a flight to Seattle. If this story has kept you hooked, do us a favor and subscribe. It really does help. The drive from the airport to Oak Haven took almost 3 hours, through dark pine forest and freezing rain. Arthur found the shop easily, a rustic 2-story building with a freshly painted sign that read The Harbor Binder. He parked across the street and sat there for 2 hours, watching the warm light in the windows, trying to work up the nerve to walk in. At 6 o'clock, the open sign flicked off. The last customer left. Arthur reached for the door handle, and then the shop's front door swung open, and Caroline stepped out onto the sidewalk, head bowed against the rain. She didn't reach for her keys. She didn't move toward a car. She just stood under the awning, completely still, her shoulders drawn in. A dark SUV pulled up to the curb. A man stepped out, late 70s, a slight limp, still built, like a wall. He walked up to Caroline and grabbed her arm, not gently. She flinched and looked away, refusing to meet his eyes. It wasn't the body language of a reunion. It was the body language of someone afraid. The man turned to check the street, and the streetlight caught his face. Arthur's whole body went cold. It had been 21 years, but he knew that face instantly. Silas Thorne. Thorne hadn't moved back east. He hadn't grieved for anyone. Caroline had been here the entire time, hidden in plain sight, under the control of the man who'd taken her from her own kitchen 2 decades ago. Arthur followed the SUV at a careful distance, headlights off, watching the taillights lead him deeper into the logging roads outside town. After nearly 20 minutes, the SUV turned through a heavy iron security gate topped with razor wire and disappeared down a long gravel drive into the trees. He had no phone signal out here, no backup, no weapon. If he left to find help, Thorne might notice something was wrong and move Caroline before anyone came back. Arthur wasn't willing to lose her again. He pulled his hood up and stepped out into the rain. He worked his way around the perimeter through thick brush, avoiding the driveway and whatever cameras might be watching it, until he found a spot where a fallen tree had crushed the fence flat. He climbed over and dropped down onto the property. It was massive. A fortified wooden cabin with barred windows sat up the drive, and about 50 yards from it, a large detached steel warehouse more like an industrial building than a garage. The whole place felt less like a home and more like a compound. Arthur crept close to the cabin and looked through the kitchen window. Caroline stood at the sink, washing dishes, her head down. Thorne sat at the table nearby with a drink, pointing a finger at her, talking. Every time he spoke, she flinched and scrubbed faster. This wasn't a partnership. This was captivity. Thorne eventually stood, grabbed a set of keys, and walked out the back, locking the door behind him with a deadbolt that needed a key from either side. Caroline was trapped inside. Arthur watched Thorne cross the muddy lawn toward the steel warehouse, unlock a heavy padlock, and disappear inside. Arthur crept to a frosted window on the side of the building and looked in. Under harsh fluorescent light, long tables were covered in drying racks, chemical baths, and stacks of aged, yellowed paper. Thorne sat at a drafting table with a magnifying glass, carefully tracing a signature onto old parchment. It clicked into place all at once. Silas Thorne wasn't a grieving shopkeeper. He was a master forger, stripping blank pages from worthless antique books and using rare inks and chemicals to fake historical documents, manuscripts, and letters, selling them to private collectors for millions. But forgeries good enough to fool auction houses needed more than a steady hand getting older and shakier by the year. They needed Caroline's talent. She hadn't been planning to leave Arthur. She'd discovered what Thorne was really doing in the back of that antique shop, and she'd been terrified of what he'd do if she went to the police. So she built herself an exit of fake identity, hidden cash, a bus ticket to Seattle, planning to disappear quietly and keep Arthur out of the blast radius entirely. But Thorne found out first. Arthur backed away from the window, shaking with a mix of horror and rage. Near the warehouse doors he found a heavy, rusted tire iron in a pile of scrap. He gripped it tight, checked that Thorne was still absorbed in his work, and ran back across the lawn toward the kitchen window. Caroline was still at the sink, staring blankly into the water. Arthur pressed his palm against the cold glass and tapped it 3 times the same signal, the habit that had led him here in the first place. Caroline's head snapped up. When she saw his face in the light, the plate in her hand slipped and shattered in the sink. She pressed both hands to her mouth, tears flooding her eyes, and moved toward the locked door. Arthur raised the tire iron to force the frame, and a bright flashlight beam cut across him from the dark edge of the porch. "You always were a persistent man, Arthur," Silas Thorne said, stepping into view. In one hand, the flashlight. In the other, a loaded revolver, aimed at Arthur's chest. "I have sensors buried at the gate," Thorne said, calm as ever. "Saw someone climbing the fence on the cameras. Didn't know it was you until I looked out the window." Inside, Caroline pounded on the glass, screaming, but the thick pain and the storm swallowed the sound. "You took her," Arthur shouted over the rain. "You faked being heartbroken. Why not just let her go?" Thorne laughed, cold and hollow. "Because she was too brilliant to lose. She figured out what I was really doing back in Michigan. When I found out she was planning to run, I broke into your house that night to kill you both and burn the place down behind me." Arthur felt the blood drain out of his face. "But she begged for your life," Thorne went on. "Stood right there in your kitchen and made me a deal she'd come with me, work for me, forge whatever I needed, for as long as I needed it, as long as I never touched you. She gave up everything to keep you breathing, Arthur." He tilted his head. "She was clever about it, too. While I was rushing her out that back door, she pricked her own finger on that locket's clasp and left the blood on the counter so the police would treat it as a violent abduction. She made sure there'd be an investigation loud enough that I could never quietly come back and finish the job." 21 years of grief cracked open into something else entirely. She hadn't left him. She traded her whole life to save his. Thorne raised the gun. "I let you live because you believed the story, but you couldn't leave it alone. So now, I have to fix what I should have finished back then." His finger tightened on the trigger, and inside, Caroline saw exactly what was about to happen. She grabbed the heaviest thing within reach, a cast iron skillet off the stove, and swung it into the window with everything she had. Glass exploded outward. The sudden crash pulled Thorne's attention for half a second, the barrel drifting an inch off target. That was enough. Arthur swung the tire iron into Thorne's wrist. Something cracked, and the revolver dropped into the mud. Arthur tackled him to the porch and pinned him there, forearm against his throat, while Caroline screamed into the phone for help. Within minutes, the quiet logging road lit up with police lights. Officers pulled Thorne off the porch and cuffed him. A female officer kicked in the shattered kitchen door, and Arthur looked through the broken frame at Caroline standing there, cut from the glass, soaked, exhausted, and unmistakably alive. Neither of them moved for a moment. Then Caroline ran, and Arthur caught her. and they held on to each other in the pouring rain like 21 years hadn't happened at all. By morning, federal agents had swarmed the property. Inside the warehouse, they found hundreds of forged documents, illegal printing chemicals, and financial records tracing back to offshore accounts worth millions. Silas Thorne was charged with kidnapping, extortion, and federal fraud. Because of the evidence and Arthur's testimony about the fake license from 1994, Caroline was cleared entirely treated, correctly, as a hostage rather than a suspect. Weeks of interviews and medical checkups followed before they were finally allowed to fly home to Holland, Michigan, together. The house looked exactly as it had the night they left it, snow fresh on the ground outside. Caroline stood on the sidewalk for a long time before she could make herself walk up to the door. Inside, by the fireplace, Arthur opened the small glass case on the mantel and took out the silver locket. He stepped behind her, moved her hair aside, and fastened it back around her neck, right where it had always been meant to stay. The story became national news, a husband recognizing his missing wife after 21 years because of a single small habit caught on a viral video. Silas Thorne was sentenced to life in federal prison and died behind bars 3 years later, alone. For Arthur and Caroline, healing wasn't instant. There was therapy. And there were nights Caroline woke up certain she was still locked in that warehouse. But every time, Arthur was right there beside her, reminding her the doors were locked, and she was finally home. Their story is proof that some things can't be forged, no matter how good the hands behind them are. A man can steal 21 years. He can build gates and warehouses and new identities to hide what he's done. But he can never fake the kind of love that remembers the exact sound of a laugh, or the way a hand taps against the spine of an old book, the kind of love that keeps looking long after everyone else has stopped, until it finally finds its way home.